I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who would arrive at a family gathering in a private helicopter, but life has a way of surprising you. 3 years ago, I was Sofia Martinez, the struggling artist who wasn't good enough for the prestigious Whitmore family. Today, I'm the CEO of an art collective that just revolutionized how emerging artists access global markets. And the look on my mother in law's face when that helicopter touched down on her perfectly manicured lawn was worth every sleepless night I'd spent building my empire. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the Connecticut air drew every head at the annual Whitmore family reunion skyward. I watched from the aircraft's window as figures in pastel polo shirts and tennis whites scattered across the lawn like startled birds. My husband Daniel squeezed my hand, his eyes bright with anticipation. He'd been the only one who believed in me when I was painting in our cramped studio apartment, selling pieces at weekend markets just to pay rent. The Whitmore family reunions had always been exercises in subtle cruelty for me. Old New England money, older prejudices, and the kind of social hierarchy that valued bloodlines over talent. From the moment Daniel brought me home 4 years ago, a Latina artist from a working class family in Queens, I was marked as an outsider. Margaret Whitmore, Daniel's mother, had made her position clear during our first Christmas together. She's certainly colorful, I'd overheard her tell Daniel's aunt in that tone that made colorful sound like a disease. I suppose Daniel feels he needs to experience different types of people, but surely he'll come to his senses eventually. I'd pretended not to hear, but the words carved themselves deep into my memory. For years, I'd endured their backhanded compliments and suggestions that I wasn't quite right for their family. I'd worn the conservative clothes Daniel bought me, toned down my accent, and tried to make myself smaller to fit into their world of country clubs and charity galas. But 3 years ago, everything changed. The reunion that year had coincided with the closure of my first gallery show, a devastating failure that left me questioning everything I'd worked for. I'd spent months preparing, investing every dollar we had into the exhibition, only to watch it fail spectacularly. The critics were brutal, attendance was dismal, and I'd lost not just money but confidence in my artistic vision. Margaret had chosen that vulnerable moment to strike. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future," she'd announced over cocktails, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This art phase has gone on long enough. Daniel has responsibilities to this family, and frankly, your little hobby is becoming an embarrassment." The word hobby hit me like a physical blow. Years of study, countless hours perfecting my craft, the sacrifices I'd made to pursue my passion, all dismissed as a hobby. "Margaret, please," Daniel had started, but she'd cut him off with a wave of her manicured hand. "No, Daniel, someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. Sophia is a lovely girl, but she's not our kind of people. She has no family connections, no understanding of our world, and this artistic delusion is only making things worse." She'd turned to me with the cold smile I'd learned to dread. "Surely you can see that you're holding him back." I'd felt something fracture inside me, not just my heart, but my entire sense of self-worth. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I'd managed to ask. "I'm suggesting you consider what's best for everyone involved. Daniel could have a brilliant career in finance, but not while he's supporting your artistic fantasies. Perhaps it's time to be realistic about your limitations." The room had fallen silent except for the ticking of their antique grandfather clock. I'd looked around at the assembled family, searching for even one sympathetic face, but found only uncomfortable expressions and carefully averted eyes. Even Daniel seemed frozen, caught between loyalty to me and deference to his family's expectations. That's when I'd stood up, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You want to know what's realistic? What's realistic is that you've spent 4 years trying to diminish me because you're terrified of anything that challenges your narrow little world. You see my art, my background, my dreams as threats because they remind you that value isn't determined by zip codes or trust funds." Margaret's composure had cracked slightly. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own home? How dare you spend years trying to convince your son that love comes with conditions?" I'd shot back. "That I need to change everything about myself to be worthy of him. Well, here's what I think about your approval." I'd walked out that night, Daniel following me to the car where I'd finally let the tears fall. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered. "I should have defended you better. I should have stopped her years ago." "Why didn't you?" I'd asked through my tears. "Because I was a coward. Because I thought if I could just get them to see you the way I see you, everything would be fine. But you're right. Their approval shouldn't matter more than your dignity. That night marked a turning point, not just in our relationship, but in how I saw myself. I'd spent so long trying to gain acceptance from people who were determined not to give it that I'd lost sight of my own worth. But Daniel's unwavering support in the aftermath gave me strength I didn't know I had. I want to try something different, I'd told him a week later. Forget traditional galleries, forget the established art world. I want to build something new. What I'd built was Artrise Collective, a platform that connected emerging artists directly with collectors, bypassing the gatekeepers who decided whose work was worthy of attention. I'd started by reaching out to artists I'd met over the years, talented people whose work was brilliant, but who couldn't get gallery representation because they didn't fit the industry's narrow definition of marketable. The first year was brutal. We'd remortgaged our apartment, drained our savings, and worked 18-hour days building the platform from our living room. I'd coded the website myself, learning programming through online tutorials while Daniel handled the business development. Our dining table became mission control, covered with laptops, sketches, and takeout containers. The breakthrough came when Maria Santos, a muralist from East LA, uploaded a series of pieces that captured the attention of a tech billionaire looking to decorate his new headquarters. The sale was for $200,000, more than Maria had made in her entire career. Word spread through the art community like wildfire. Here was a platform that actually paid artists fairly, that celebrated diversity instead of demanding conformity. Within 6 months, we had 5,000 artists on the platform. Within a year, we'd facilitated over 10 million in sales. The traditional art world tried to dismiss us as a fad, but they couldn't ignore our impact. Young collectors loved the accessibility, established collectors appreciated discovering new talent, and artists finally had a way to build sustainable careers without compromising their vision. The second round of funding changed everything. 15 million from investors who believed in our mission of democratizing the art world. I was featured on magazine covers, invited to speak at conferences, recognized as one of the most innovative entrepreneurs in the creative economy. But the real validation came from the artists whose lives we'd changed. Now, 3 years later, we hadn't attended a family reunion. Partly because I was too busy, partly because Daniel was still working through his relationship with his family after standing up to them. But this year felt different. This year, I had something to prove. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through our headsets. We'll be landing in approximately 2 minutes. The estate's lawn should provide adequate space. I smoothed my dress, a stunning piece by one of our platform's breakthrough designers that had been featured in Vogue. My jewelry was created by a collective of indigenous artists from New Mexico, whose work now commanded premium prices at international shows. Everything I wore represented the artists and artisans who'd been overlooked by the traditional systems I'd helped disrupt. Are you ready for this? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the rotors. I've been ready for 3 years, I replied. As we descended, I could see the family scattered across the lawn, hands shielding their eyes as they tried to identify the aircraft. The Whitmore estate sprawled before us, all manicured gardens and old money restraint. I'd once found it intimidating, a physical manifestation of everything I wasn't. Now it just looks small. The helicopter touched down with surprising gentleness, the pilot giving us a thumbs up as the rotors began to slow. Through the window, I could see Margaret Whitmore striding across the lawn, her face a mask of controlled fury. Behind her trailed the usual cast of characters: Daniel's father Richard, his sister Caroline, various aunts and uncles and cousins who'd spent years making me feel like an interloper at their family gatherings. Here we go, Daniel muttered, unstrapping his harness. The pilot opened our door and helped us out. I took a deep breath of Connecticut air, straightening my shoulders as the family approached. The helicopter's presence had clearly thrown them off their game. This wasn't how things were supposed to work at Whitmore gatherings. Arrivals were meant to be discreet, tasteful, understated. Daniel, Margaret called out, her voice straining to sound welcoming despite the obvious tension. What on earth is this about? Daniel took my hand as we walked toward the group, our steps steady and confident. Hello, Mother. Everyone. Sorry we're a bit dramatic today, but we're flying to Miami tonight for an art fair, and this was the most efficient option. An art fair? Richard Whitmore's voice carried the same dismissive tone I remembered. Still playing around with those hobbies, I see. Something inside me clicked into place. The old Sophia would have flinched at that word. The new Sophia smiled. Actually, Richard, Art Tries Collective isn't a hobby anymore. We just closed our Series C funding round at a $50 million valuation. I'm not playing around with anything. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's carefully composed expression flickered between shock and calculation. Caroline's mouth actually fell open. The various relatives who'd spent years looking through me like I was invisible suddenly found me very visible indeed. 50 million, Caroline finally managed. Dollars. That's what they use for valuations, I replied pleasantly. Though honestly, the money isn't what matters most. It's the impact we're having on artists' lives. Just last month, one of our painters used her earnings to buy her first house. A sculptor paid off her student loans. A photographer opened his own studio. Margaret recovered first, as I'd known she would. Years of social conditioning had taught her to adapt quickly to new hierarchies. Well, that's quite impressive, Sophia, though I have to say, this arrival is rather ostentatious for a family gathering. Is it? I asked mildly. I thought it was practical. We have meetings in 3 cities this week, and commercial aviation doesn't accommodate that schedule. Daniel squeezed my hand, and I could feel his pride radiating through the gesture. He'd watched me build this company from nothing, had seen the late nights and early mornings, the rejections and setbacks, the slow climb from ridicule to respect. Come inside, Margaret said, her hostess instincts finally kicking in. Everyone's here, you must catch up with the family. As we walked toward the house, I caught snippets of whispered conversations behind us. The relatives were processing this new information, recalibrating their understanding of my place in their social ecosystem. I was no longer the struggling artist who wasn't good enough for Daniel. I was now a successful entrepreneur who'd arrived at their family reunion in a helicopter. The living room buzzed with barely contained curiosity as we entered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned our way. I recognized the expressions surprise, calculation, and in some cases, the dawning realization that they'd badly misjudged me. Sophia, Daniel's cousin James, approached with enthusiasm that was definitely new. I was just reading about your company in Forbes. Incredible growth trajectory. You must be proud. 3 years ago, James had barely acknowledged my existence. Now he was practically glowing with second-hand importance at being related to someone newsworthy. Thank you, I replied graciously. It's been quite a journey. I have to ask, interrupted Daniel's Aunt Patricia, her jewelry glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. How did you know it would be successful? I mean, art seems so unpredictable. The question itself revealed everything about how they still saw the creative world. As something frivolous, unpredictable, not serious like their world of investments and inherited wealth. That's exactly why it works, I explained patiently. The traditional art world was built around scarcity and gatekeeping. We built around abundance and access. When you remove arbitrary barriers, talent rises to the surface naturally. Richard cleared his throat from his position by the fireplace. But surely there's a quality control issue? How do you maintain standards without proper curation? I smiled. That's an interesting assumption, Richard. That quality requires traditional gatekeepers. Our platform uses a combination of peer review, collector feedback, and algorithmic analysis to surface the best work. Turns out, democracy works pretty well when you design the systems properly. Margaret appeared at my elbow with a martini I hadn't requested. Tell us about the investors, she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when discussing important social connections. Anyone we might know. And there it was, the real question. Not about my work or its impact, but about whether my success came with the right social credentials attached. A mix of institutional investors and private equity, I said. Chen Capital led the round. Marissa Chen was particularly interested in our social impact metrics. I didn't mention that Marissa Chen was one of the most powerful women in Silicon Valley, or that she'd called my work revolutionary. Let them draw their own conclusions. The afternoon continued in this vein, with family members who'd ignored me for years suddenly finding my work fascinating. Caroline asked detailed questions about our revenue model. James wanted to know about expansion plans. Patricia inquired about whether we were hiring. But Margaret remained watchful, her social antennae clearly picking up on something that bothered her about my transformation. During a lull in conversation, she approached me with purpose. Sophia, dear, might I have a word, privately? We stepped onto the terrace overlooking the garden where I'd once felt so out of place. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly maintained lawn. I owe you an apology, Margaret began, her voice carefully modulated. I may have been hasty in my earlier judgments about your potential. I waited, knowing there was more coming. I hope you understand that my concerns came from a place of love for Daniel. I wanted to ensure he had every opportunity for success. And you thought I was preventing that, I said quietly. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. I thought your artistic pursuits were impractical. I didn't understand the changing landscape of creative industries. What you didn't understand, I corrected gently, was that dismissing someone based on their background or their dreams says more about your limitations than theirs. The words hung between us, not cruel but clear. Margaret's composure wavered slightly. Perhaps we could start over, she suggested. Family is important after all. I looked out at the garden where I'd once felt so small, remembering the girl who tried to shrink herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. Family is important, I agreed, but respect has to be earned through actions, not circumstances. That evening, as we prepared to leave for our flight to Miami, Daniel's family gathered on the lawn to see us off. The helicopter sat waiting, its sleek form a stark contrast to the traditional elegance of the estate. This has been illuminating, Richard said, shaking my hand with newfound firmness. Perhaps we should discuss investment opportunities sometime. Perhaps, I replied noncommittally. Margaret approached as we neared the aircraft. Sophia, I hope this isn't goodbye. I'd like to learn more about your work. My door is always open to family, I said, emphasizing the last word slightly. As the helicopter lifted off, I watched the estate shrink below us. The people who'd once made me feel worthless now looked like tiny figures scattered across an emerald lawn, but I felt no particular satisfaction in their change of attitude. Their approval or disapproval had ceased to matter the moment I'd stopped seeking it. How do you feel? Daniel asked through our headsets as Connecticut fell away beneath us. Free, I answered honestly, finally free. The flight to Miami took just over 2 hours, giving us time to review the presentation for the art fair's opening gala. Artrise Collective was unveiling our new VR platform that would allow collectors to experience artworks in virtual galleries before purchasing. It was revolutionary technology that would further democratize access to art by removing geographical barriers. Nervous about tomorrow? Daniel asked as we descended toward Miami. Excited, I corrected. We're about to change the game again. The art fair was a revelation. Our VR platform drew crowds of curious collectors and artists, eager to understand how technology could enhance, rather than replace the traditional art experience. By the end of the first day, we'd signed partnerships with 3 major museums and received inquiries from collectors in 12 countries. But the real highlight came when Alina Rodriguez, a young painter from our platform, sold her first piece for $25,000 to a collector in Tokyo who'd experienced it through our VR system. Watching Alina's face as she realized her life had just changed was worth more than any family approval. You did this, Daniel said as we watched Alina celebrate with her friends. You built something that actually matters. 3 months later, I received an unexpected phone call from Margaret Whitmore. The Whitmore Foundation, she explained, was interested in supporting emerging artists through a new grant program. Would I consider consulting on its development? The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd once dismissed my artistic ambitions as a hobby now wanted my expertise in supporting other artists. But I agreed to meet, curious about whether her interest was genuine or simply a way to bask in reflected success. The foundation offices in Manhattan were exactly what I'd expected: understated elegance with an air of serious purpose. Margaret greeted me with a warmth that seemed more authentic than her previous attempts at civility. Thank you for coming, she said, leading me to a conference room with large windows overlooking Central Park. I've been doing quite a bit of research into your work. It's remarkable what you've accomplished. Thank you, I replied, still somewhat wary. I want to be honest about something, Margaret continued, her composure more relaxed than I'd ever seen it. I've spent most of my life believing that value came from tradition, from maintaining established systems. Watching you succeed by dismantling those systems has been educational. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation, but finding what appeared to be genuine reflection. The foundation has significant resources, she went on. Resources that could support artists who are where you were 5 years ago, but we need guidance from someone who understands what emerging artists actually need, not what we think they need. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret outlined an ambitious plan to provide not just financial support, but mentorship, studio space, and marketing assistance to artists from underrepresented communities. It was thoughtful, comprehensive, and surprisingly radical for an organization rooted in old money conservatism. What changed your mind? I asked as our meeting concluded. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Watching you succeed despite us, not because of us, made me realize how much talent we'd probably overlooked over the years. How many brilliant people we'd dismissed because they didn't fit our preconceptions. She paused. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being wrong about what matters. The Whitmore Foundation grant program launched 6 months later, providing comprehensive support to 50 emerging artists in its first year. I served on the selection committee, ensuring that the same barriers I'd faced wouldn't exclude deserving candidates. The first recipient was Marcus Washington, a sculptor from Detroit whose work explored themes of urban renewal through repurposed materials. His pieces were powerful, challenging, exactly the kind of art that traditional institutions might have found uncomfortable. But Margaret championed his selection personally, arguing that discomfort often indicated the most important work. At the Foundation's inaugural gala, I watched Margaret introduce Marcus to a room full of potential collectors and supporters. Her presentation was passionate, informed, completely different from the dismissive woman who'd once called my art a hobby. She's really changed, Daniel observed as we watched his mother expertly work the room on Marcus's behalf. People can surprise you, I agreed, when they want to. Later that evening, Margaret approached me with a glass of champagne and an expression I couldn't quite read. I owe you more than an apology, she said quietly. I owe you gratitude. This foundation, this work, it's given me purpose I didn't know I was missing. Supporting artists will do that, I replied. It's addictive when you see the impact. She nodded. I spent so many years preserving things that didn't need preserving while ignoring things that desperately needed support. You showed me the difference. 2 years later, Artrise Collective went public at a valuation of $200 million. The offering was oversubscribed, with investors recognizing that we'd fundamentally changed how art was discovered, purchased, and valued. But for me, the real milestone came the same week when we announced that artists on our platform had collectively earned their first $1 billion. The IPO celebration was held at the Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by works from artists who'd found success through our platform. Elena Rodriguez's paintings hung alongside pieces by established masters, a testament to how the definition of artistic value was evolving. During my speech to investors and supporters, I caught sight of Margaret in the crowd. She'd become a fixture at art events, her foundation having supported over 200 artists in just 2 years. Beside her stood Daniel, his pride evident as he watched me address the room. 3 years ago, I told the assembled crowd, I was told that my artistic vision was impractical, that my dreams were hobbies, that I should accept my limitations. Tonight, we celebrate the fact that limitations are often just lack of imagination. When we remove barriers, when we create access, when we trust in talent regardless of its packaging, extraordinary things happen. The applause was thunderous, but I was thinking about a different kind of success. Not the valuation or the media coverage, but the message I'd received that morning from a teenage artist in rural Montana whose first sale through our platform had paid for her college applications. After the celebration, Daniel and I walked through Central Park, the city lights sparkling around us like earthbound stars. Do you ever think about that reunion? He asked as we sat on a bench overlooking the pond. Sometimes, I admitted, but not the way you might think. I don't think about proving them wrong anymore. I think about how freeing it was to stop trying to prove anything to them at all. He took my hand, his thumb tracing patterns on my palm. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. You got there, I said simply. That's what matters. A year later, we were back at the Whitmore estate for Daniel's father's 70th birthday. But this time, instead of arriving by helicopter, we drove up in the electric car we'd bought from an artist who'd used her Artrise earnings to start a sustainable transportation company. The reunion felt different this time, not because the family had fundamentally changed, but because I no longer needed their validation to know my worth. Margaret greeted me with genuine warmth, immediately launching into excited talk about the Foundation's latest grant recipients. Caroline asked thoughtful questions about our expansion into European markets. Richard actually seemed interested in my perspective on the art market's evolution. But the moment that stayed with me came when Margaret pulled me aside before dinner. "I have something for you," she said, leading me to her study. On the wall hung a small painting I recognized immediately, one of my pieces from that failed gallery show 3 years ago. "Where did you get this?" I asked, shocked. "I bought it from the gallery after everything closed," she admitted. I told myself it was an investment, but honestly, I think I was trying to understand what Daniel saw in your work that I couldn't see. I stared at the painting, remembering the heartbreak of that exhibition's failure, the doubts it had triggered, the harsh words that had followed. "And what do you see now?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying the piece. "Hope," she said finally. "I see someone who refused to let failure define her, someone who kept creating even when the world told her to stop. I see my son's wife, who built something beautiful from nothing but vision and determination." That evening at dinner, as I listened to the familiar rhythm of Whitmore family conversation, I realized that my success hadn't been about proving them wrong. It had been about proving myself right. Right to trust my vision, right to pursue my dreams, right to believe that barriers were meant to be broken rather than accepted. The helicopter that had once seemed like the ultimate revenge now sat unused in a hangar, a symbol of a kind of validation I no longer needed. True success, I'd learned, wasn't about making dramatic entrances or shocking those who doubted you. It was about building something meaningful that would outlast the doubts, the dismissals, and even the eventual acceptance. As we prepared to leave that night, Margaret walked us to our car. "Thank you," she said, her words directed at me, but encompassing more than I think she realized. "For what?" "For not giving up on us," she replied, "for showing us there was a better way to be." Driving home through the Connecticut night, Daniel reached over and took my hand. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The struggles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, the gradual building of something that mattered. The girl who'd once felt so small in the face of their disapproval, and the woman who'd learned to measure her worth by her own standards. "None," I said, and meant it completely. Because the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming so fully yourself that their opinions become irrelevant. It's building something so meaningful that the moment you needed their approval feels like a distant memory from someone else's life. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's watching the people who once dismissed you learn to see the world through the vision you refused to abandon, even when they told you it would never work. The road stretched ahead of us, dark and full of possibility, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it as the woman I'd fought to become. Uncompromising in my vision, unshakable in my worth, and uninterested in anyone's permission to dream.